Well, hello viewers, I hope you're all doing very well. Today we're going to be testing out this lapel microphone to see how the audio quality compares to using the Tascam on its own or using the phone on its own. And so we're going to take the opportunity to answer one of the questions posed by our most prevalent viewer, a certain Trista Brister. And Trista Brister asks, why is there a double standard regarding nuclear weapons? Why are some nations, such as Israel, allowed to have them, while some nations, such as Iran, are not allowed to own them? So this is an excellent question, and there really is no standard. In fact, no nations are allowed to have nuclear weapons. All the nations which them, which includes the United States, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, now Russia, China, as well as India and Pakistan and Israel and North Korea, of course. All of these nations acquired them despite the opposition of every other nation on Earth. So, for example, France and Britain are both very close allies of the United States. However, the U.S. desired to have a monopoly on nuclear weapons to prevent any sort of complications when it came to who was in charge. But the French and the British obviously didn't like this, so they went and independently acquired their own nuclear weapons to the chagrin of the United States. And this is true of everybody. The Indians, nobody wanted them to have nukes. The Pakistanis, certainly no one wanted them to have nukes. And the Israelis as well. So the Israeli nuclear program goes back to the 1950s, and they were in a very precarious strategic position, being surrounded on the north, the east, and the south by Arabs who wished to make them a non-existent political entity. And so their very national survival was based upon the acquisition of nuclear weapons. And luckily, I remember we recall that France wanted its own nukes without the permission of the United States. France needed assistance in creating these nuclear weapons, and if you'll recall from the movie Oppenheimer himself was Jewish, as was Edward Teller, as was a certain Albert Einstein. There is some sort of prevalence of Jewish people in the nuclear physics world, particularly at that time. And so the French went to the Israelis, or what would become the Israelis, and asked for assistance in their program, and in exchange for that they offered the Israelis access to their own research and a nuclear reactor. And this is where you sort of have that crossover, where the French didn't give nuclear weapons to the Israelis, but they did provide a nuclear reactor, which then was able to produce the enriched uranium necessary to create a bomb, or the plutonium, I guess. And that's how it happened with the Indians as well. The Indians acquired a reactor from the Canadians for civilian purposes, as the Israelis did to the French, and ultimately they turned this into a bomb, which surprised everybody. So in all cases, there's no sort of standard, there's no permission to be given. And so what makes Iran and Israel different? Well, Israel again got the bomb way back in the 1960s, back before we had drones and the ability to sort of surgically remove structures without using, overwhelming force. So whether or not the United States even wanted to steal the nukes away from the Israelis, it wasn't an option as it is today. And in fact, when John F. Kennedy, who was president in 1960, when he discovered the Israelis were developing a nuclear weapon, he was furious, but it was too late. There was nothing he could do. Because what are you going to do, nuke the Israelis to try to prevent them from having nukes? Again, there's no drone strikes, there's no laser-guided bombs at this point, so war was a sort of carpet bombing affair. There was no special forces sort of thing going on, as there is today. So Iran at the time had no interest in developing its own nuclear weapon because it was a very close ally of the United States up until 1979. So that's another reason why people don't develop nuclear weapons, is because of a close alliance with a nuclear power which provides their sort of umbrella of security. For example, Taiwan wanted to develop a nuclear weapon, and we convinced them not to do that. South Korea also wanted to develop a nuclear weapon, and we convinced them not to do that either, because we would provide our own to protect them from whatever may happen. So I hope that makes a little sense. It was a little bit confusing. One thing I think that's important to keep in mind is the difference in security of Israel and Iran. So Israel is surrounded on all sides by enemies. Well, back in the 1950s, it was surrounded by enemies, and the 60s. Today, not so much. When it developed the bomb, it was surrounded by enemies and had the strategic depth of a New Jersey. So the Israelis knew that they could lose a war within days. They had no chance of stalling out people in a sort of guerrilla war. They had no strategic depth because they had no territory. Meanwhile, Iran is twice the size of Texas. And so even though it's surrounded by people who aren't the kindest to it, such as Iraq and Pakistan, neither of these countries present a existential threat that would demand a nuclear weapon, because they have this huge amount of territory which they could fight a guerrilla war in if necessary. And in fact, Iran was invaded by Iraq, which was a very heavily mechanized army at the time, and Iraq was not successful in achieving any sort of depth in the advance. And so while Israel may require or required that nuclear weapon to guarantee its survival in the 1960s and 70s even, that demand is not there for Iran. So the only reason that Iran desires a nuclear weapon is to avoid regime change, not an existential crisis to the nation, but an existential crisis to the regime. The same goes for the North Koreans, where you have this sort of totalitarian regime which is not popular to its people, but strong enough to beat them down. And thus, its only real threat is from the outside. And if you have a nuclear weapon, you can keep that outside threat away, as the North Koreans have done. So North Korea, with their little nuclear hand grenade, are going to be safe forever. He'll be able to have his slaves for the rest of his life, and potentially for the rest of the life of whoever succeeds him. And Iran is no different. Iran desires to have this religious monopoly on political power for the rest of forever, and the way to guarantee that is to acquire a nuclear weapon. So sorry, I hope that is at least moderately sensible. I didn't write much of a script at all, or any script. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, I look forward to any sort of complaints, and I hope you're well. Say hi to everybody for me. Love you, miss you. You take care. Peace.